Many of you heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. I like to say that I'm in the democracy business. That's what I do. And what a time to be in the democracy business, am I right? This has been nothing short of extraordinary these last few years. And it has exposed a lot of the vulnerabilities of American democracy. We could go on for hours here talking about what those are. That's how I see these last several years, as an exposure of some of the vulnerabilities that we have in this country in terms of who we elect and how. And at the end of the day, as Representative Pinto just said, it is about effectuating the voice of the people. And one of the things that really appeals to me about ranked choice voting is the idea, as Dane Smith says, that it will create new pathways for coalition building. It is, as Representative Pinto said, the idea that it's a fuller expression of people's preferences. But it's more than just that. I think in this era of increasing polarization, any system that can potentially promise real majority support, ultimately at the end of the day, majority support for a candidate is something worth paying very close attention to. We're an increasingly fractured country, fractured along all sorts of different lines and levels, and to the extent we can embrace a system, at least at some level, and analyze it and closely look at it, that will guarantee that the winner of an election actually commands majority support, I think that's good for America. So I think that's, I suspect, one of the reasons why many people are here in this room, and I look forward to a discussion now and into the future about how we can make that more of an immediate reality for Minnesota and for our country. So thank you very much.
Okay, Steve, are you ready?
Ready as I'll ever be.
You mentioned the vulnerability of the election system, which was certainly revealed to us more than ever in 2016. In this last session, you really were working hard to get funding for election security, to safeguard the integrity of elections against hacking and so forth. Can you explain why this is so important, and also tell us why the heck the Senate pushed back on it?
I'll start with the first part first. Let's just zoom out for a minute and state something which unfortunately needs restating. It shouldn't, but it does, and in this day and age, it's unfortunate. Minnesota was one of the 21 states whose election system was targeted by a foreign government in 2016. Full stop. End of story. It's not subject to debate. It's not subject to argument. It's the unanimous, repeated, and recent conclusion of all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. It's frustrating to me that I and others have to keep repeating that. That is a fact. There are some who still dispute it. There's some who want to distract from it, but that is a fact. And how we react to that says a lot about us in Minnesota and in this country. And so the good news is the bad guys didn't get in. Nothing bad happened. The system worked. But it is a sobering thing that a foreign adversary or anyone was in a position to be able, perhaps, to mess with the instruments of our democracy. And so it's very, very important. We don't want anyone out there thinking that their vote will not count because our system is not secure. So the federal government in 2018, in March of 2018, stepped up and stood up and provided hundreds of millions of dollars in financial support to states, to secretaries of state, for election security. We badly, badly needed it. Minnesota's share of that was $6.6 million, and in almost every other state, that would have been the end of the story. It would have been a direct pipeline from the federal treasury to the Office of Secretary of State, but Minnesota is one of those few states, one of 5, where there's an additional hurdle or speed bump. That is a law on the books in our state which says that when our office, when Congress appropriates money of that kind to our office for that purpose, the state legislature, the Minnesota state legislature here in St. Paul, has to sign off on it and bless it. There are a lot of reasons why that law went into effect. I wish it weren't there, but it is. And so for reasons that I still can't fully articulate it, though I was in the midst of this fight for over a year, I still can't give you the objective verbal paragraph that justifies why that money was held up for over a year, other than to say it was pure politics, and all it did was risk making us less safe. The good news is that we got the money finally at the end of this last legislative session. And if there's any advantage to being last in the country, last, dead last, 50th out of 50 in getting that money, it's that we have the benefit of other states' experience. So we can call up Kentucky or California or Connecticut and say what worked and what didn't. And we've drawn on their experience, and we are ramping up and staffing up and powering up and using that money now belatedly to make our system more secure in 2020 and beyond. It's still a very, very important issue. All of the intelligence authorities have told us, and behind closed doors briefing, that there are several adversaries now, not just one, that have both the appetite and the capability to do what was done in 2016. The appetite and the capability. They want to do it, and they can do it. Will they do it? We don't know. But I think Minnesota's in a good position. We would have been better had we gotten that money sooner, but we're in a good, strong position. Can I tell you that there's a 100% chance that nothing bad will happen? No, I can't. That would be dishonest, and it would be pandering, and it would be untrue. I can't tell you that any more than Target or U.S. Bank or any other large institution can, but I can tell you that I feel very good about where we are. We are working every day to minimize the risks, work with the intelligence community, work with IT professionals, and I feel very good about where we are.
Great, thanks, Steve. So another issue that I know has been important to you is ensuring that all voters have an easy time voting.
Right.
Just as an aside, we were in Austin, Texas a few years ago during primary season, in Texas of all places. It was Austin. And we were shocked to find polling places in drugstores and shopping malls and, I mean, places where people go anyway, and it was easy for them to vote. So I was really intrigued by that in Texas. What are you seeing here in terms of improving access to the polls or making it easier for people to vote? What are you working on?
So that's my bottom line, is making it as easy as possible for all eligible Minnesotans to vote. The good news is we've got a great track record. For the last 2 elections in a row, Minnesota has been #1 in the United States of America for voter turnout, which is great.
I forgot to compliment you on that.
Yeah.
I intended to.
Well, it's not a compliment to me, it's a compliment to Minnesota.
It's a really
But
great thing for Minnesota to lead.
it is, definitely. So for the last 2 in a row, we've been #1, top of the heap. The most important thing, even more important than being #1, is beating Wisconsin, right? Let's face it. Let's face it. If we were 47th and they were 48th, we'd be secretly a little bit happy, right? So, but the point is, that's the good news, and we've got great laws on the books and a good healthy civic culture, and all the rest. But there are things we can and should be doing in Minnesota to ensure not just that we're #1, but that we really afford maximum access to people all over. And let me just give you a few examples, and we could go on and on about any one of them, but I won't. One is, I want to see us move in the direction of automatic voter registration. It's time. There are over a dozen states in this country, including red states, blue states, and states in between that have enacted it. There are so many good reasons to do it. It would make the system more efficient and effective. I want to see us have pre-registration for high school students, 16 and 17-year-olds. States like California, Florida, again, red states, blue states, West Virginia, hardly a progressive dark blue bastion, which have pre-registration for high school students. That's another thing. I think it's high time that we restore the right to vote for those who have left prison behind. That's something that's very important for us to do. And so there are a number of reforms that I think we can and should tackle. I think given the current political environment in the state legislature, that's going to be difficult. But in the nearer term, and hopefully sooner rather than later, I think we can get the kind of a bipartisan support that we need to get all of those things done. But those are some of the things that we should be doing. And not to mention, or I should mention, especially here, Jean Massey and Nancy Haas and I and others have been conspiring for a long time to pass a very simple law, a very fair law, that would make it so much easier for more jurisdictions in Minnesota at the local level to adopt ranked choice voting. Right now, as many of you know, we have a sort of a dual system. For charter cities, there's still hoops and hurdles to go through, but it's a much easier path for charter cities to adopt ranked choice voting if they choose. Not so much for statutory cities, which is the other classification of cities. And so they have to come on bended knee to the legislature begging for specific legislation to enable them and allow them to adopt ranked choice voting, and I think that's wrong. I think it's unfair. We need to level the playing field, so that's something we've worked on for a long time. So long that I carried the bill when I was a legislator. It wasn't that long ago, but so it's been several years that we've been working on that legislation. So those are just some examples of the things that I think we should adopt.
Steve, on that local options issue, what might any of us in the audience do to help move that along?
Yeah.
I have a feeling everybody's legislators who represent people in this room probably already support it, but
Yeah.
what else might we do?
I think there are a couple things, and I was thinking about this as I was thinking about this event. What are the impediments? Why are people gun shy about ranked choice voting, or at least allowing more municipalities and local governments to do it? I think it's primarily a couple things. One is it's just new, and that's human nature. It's new. But every year that passes, and as we see places like New York City and the state of Maine and others adopting it, the city of St. Louis Park, and perhaps others, as I'm sure Gene will give you an update on in Minnesota, it becomes less new. It becomes less strange. It becomes less alien. It becomes more familiar. You know, Minneapolis and St. Paul alone have several 100,000 people. Over 10% of Minnesota now lives in a jurisdiction that has as its primary way of electing local officials ranked choice voting. So it's less scary and alien now than it once was. So I think one is just to introduce people to the concept in that way and say that this is now moving into the mainstream. A second thing, I think, is to counteract the idea that there's something complex about ranked choice voting. You know, sorry to bring up a sore subject, but many of you know that in the city of Duluth, a handful of years ago, there was a vote on ranked choice voting that was unsuccessful for those who were in favor of ranked choice voting. And one of the lines that opponents used was, keep voting simple. Keep voting simple. The idea being that ranked choice voting is somehow some very confusing and convoluted and strange way of voting when it's really not. So I think to the extent you can talk to influencers and thought leaders, including but not limited to legislators, and convince them that no, there's nothing particularly complex about ranking choices 1 through 3 or 4 or 5, I think those two things would go a long way, among others, in persuading people that this is something worth taking a very careful look at. And even to those who aren't yet sold, at least let those who are sold proceed with their plans and don't make it more difficult than it needs to be.
Thank you. So this is going to be a really unusual year for Minnesota, or 2020 will be, with a presidential primary. My gosh, it's pretty shocking to go from years and years, decades of caucuses to a presidential primary. How did we get here, or why did we get here? And what is your expectation for how it's going to work, and so forth and so on?
So how do we get here? There's some people in the room who were in the legislature in 2016 who can attest to this. How we got here, in a nutshell, from my vantage point, is legislators concluded, by and large, that the caucus system for choosing presidential delegates to nominating conventions was a victim, that process was a victim of its own success. So many people turned out in both parties in 2016. There was so much excitement and energy and turnout. After all, it was an open seat presidential election. So there was no incumbent running for re-election in 2016, so a lot of energy in both parties, that it literally overwhelmed the ability of volunteers in political parties to handle it. So the legislature in 2016 basically decided, and I'm paraphrasing, and I'm ready to stand corrected if you think I'm spinning it a different way to the legislators in the room, but legislators decided, look, we're going to keep caucuses, and that's something to bear in mind. Caucuses are not going away, okay? Precinct caucuses will happen in Minnesota a week earlier than the March 3rd Super Tuesday primary. So you'll still have caucuses for everything else, every other office under the sun, state senate, House of Representatives, U.S. Senate, Secretary of State, platform issues, you name it. We're keeping it. But what the legislature said is we are going to take out and remove this one contest, President of the United States, only this one contest, only every 4 years, obviously, and run it in a separate parallel track as an actual election, with real election judges in real polling places and real election laws that apply, not pieces of scratch paper in a high school gym and all the rest. And so that's how we got here. So March 3rd, Super Tuesday, so named because another 9 or 10 states will also be having a presidential primary contest on that day, is our day, but it's really closer than you'd imagine. Yes, that's the actual game day, election day, but absentee voting for that contest will start January 17th. That's 45 days from today. So 45 days from today, everyone in this room who cares to will have a voice in their chosen party's presidential nominee. There is a hiccup, though, that I want to talk about, and it's one that concerns me, and this is doubles as a public service announcement to the legislators in the room that I hope they'll support a couple initiatives that our office will be pushing. The way that the legislature wrote the law in 2016 was to say that we will have separate ballots based on parties for President of the United States. So in other words, to a voter going in on March 3rd, that voter will have to choose either the Republican Party ballot or the Democratic Party presidential ballot or the ballot, conceivably, of the two other newer major parties, which are two marijuana legalization parties which achieved major party status last election. So up to 4, those two parties haven't said yet whether they're participating, so there's an asterisk there, but the voter will have to disclose which ballot they want to choose. The record of which ballot the voter chooses was originally going to be public, totally public. So not just a journalist, but it could be your nosy neighbor or anyone could get the list of everyone in Minnesota who chose the blue ballot or the red ballot or the marijuana legalization ballots. That was changed this last legislative session. Thank you, legislators, for supporting that. So it's no longer going to be public, but all 4 major parties will get all 4 lists. All 4 will get all 4. So it's not like a caucus sign-in sheet where you go in, and there's probably an expectation if you go into a Republican Party caucus that the Republican Party is going to get that sign-in sheet. I don't think anyone's shocked by that. But you wouldn't think if you attended a Republican caucus that 3 other political parties are also going to get that sign-in sheet. That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen. So I think it's unfortunate. It came about for a lot of reasons that we can go into, but those are the rules of the road this time. The other thing that concerns me, and here's the legislative proposal that we have had and will renew this legislative session, is there are few, if any, restrictions on what the parties then can do with that data. So all 4 parties are going to get all 4 lists of voters and who chose what ballot. Obviously not which candidate you chose. We have a secret ballot in this country and in this state, but they'll know whether you voted in the DFL primary, the Republican Party, and so forth. And there are virtually no restrictions on what the parties can do with that. Can a party just post it to the internet? Can a party say, here, Minnesota, we got all 4 lists for you? Our interpretation is, yeah, probably, right now. So we think there ought to be some rules of the road, some guardrails that rein in what the parties can do. Fortunately, we have a template. There are other areas of state statute that govern what political parties can do with other kinds of election data. You could literally just cut and paste that language and put it into this section of statute. So we'll be at the legislature on February 11th. There's still time. The election isn't until March 3rd.
There's already, what I think I heard today on the radio, 16 still in the race for the Democratic primary or the Democratic nomination. Again, ranked voting would be a really great way to winnow that field and sort of sort it out and who is for whom and so forth and so on. A handful of states are using ranked voting in their primaries. We're not. And I'm wondering what you think about that potential going forward. Do you see that we could incorporate it into our process?
You know, I think it could be incorporated into our process. We'll see what the legislative and other appetite is, but I think a party contest like a primary, whether presidential or otherwise, it's a pretty good proving ground for something like ranked choice voting.
And the parties have a lot of say in the primary, in the structure of the primary.
That's right.
So they really don't necessarily have a reason to oppose it.
Right, and there's some...
Like many times the Republicans oppose doing anything with ranked voting, but the DFL is more or less more open to it.
Yeah, and I was going to say that there's been talk in Minnesota among a number of parties of introducing in a more vigorous way ranked choice voting into internal deliberations, whether it's state central committee votes or whether it's even convention floor votes at a state political convention. So I think there's an appetite to explore that in intra-party